Some men learn too late that power without wisdom is just borrowed time. Vernon Haskell learned this lesson at dawn, standing in his own yard, watching 300 mounted warriors emerge from the morning haze like a judgment he couldn't outrun. The young rancher he had humiliated a week earlier stood 50 yards away, alone in the center of that vast open ground. Behind him, warriors stretched across the horizon, silent as stone, their presence turning the air heavy with consequence. Vernon's hands trembled as he finally understood what his arrogance had cost him, because the man he had called worthless, the one he had degraded in front of the entire town, carried something Vernon would never possess, a bond forged in blood, and honored by 300 souls who had ridden through the night to stand with him. Kalen Bridger had never asked for much from the world. His small ranch sat at the edge of the territory where the grasslands met the foothills and civilization thinned to almost nothing. He worked alone most days, tending cattle that would never make him wealthy, fixing fences that would need fixing again next season. The land was hard, but it was his, and that mattered more than comfort or easy money. That morning, he rode into town with 6 head of cattle to sell. The sun was already brutal by the time he reached the main road, and dust coated everything: his clothes, his hat, the leather reins in his calloused hands. He wasn't going to town for pleasure. He needed supplies, and selling those cattle was the only way to pay for them. The settlement wasn't large. Maybe 30 buildings clustered around a single dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. Ken knew most folks by face, if not by name. Some nodded when he passed, others looked away. He had grown used to that, the way people treated him like he existed in some space between belonging and not quite fitting in. He tied his horse outside the livestock pen and began the work of moving the cattle into the holding area. The animals were tired from the journey, but they moved without much resistance. Kalen worked quietly, efficiently, the way he did everything. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. That's when he saw Vernon Haskell watching him from across the street. Vernon owned more land than any 3 men combined. His ranch stretched for miles in every direction, and his cattle bore a brand that everyone recognized. He dressed like wealth: clean vest, polished boots, a hat that had never seen a day of real work. 2 men stood beside him: Dalton Cray, who had a reputation for solving Vernon's problems with his fists, and Merritt Stone, a merchant who laughed at Vernon's jokes even when they weren't funny. Ken felt their eyes on him, but kept working. He had learned long ago that men like Vernon didn't need a reason to cause trouble. Sometimes just existing in their line of sight was enough. He finished with the cattle and walked toward the land office to finalize the sale. The street was busy, wagons rolling past, people moving between buildings, the sounds of hammers and voices filling the air. Kalen kept his head down, moving with purpose, but Vernon stepped into his path. Kalen stopped. Vernon smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just the cold amusement of a man who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. Callum Bridger, Vernon said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. Didn't expect to see you in town. Thought you preferred keeping to yourself out there in the dirt. Callan met his eyes, but said nothing. Words wouldn't help here. They never did. Vernon's smile widened. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you just don't have anything worth saying. Dalton and Merritt laughed. Few people on the street slowed, watching. Kalen could feel the attention shifting toward him, feel the weight of eyes measuring what would happen next. He took a breath and stepped to the side, trying to move around Vernon, without escalating. But Vernon moved with him, blocking his path again. Where are you going in such a hurry? Vernon asked. We're just trying to be friendly. Kalen's jaw tightened. He could feel the trap closing, could sense the shape of what was coming. And deep in his memory, he recalled words spoken years ago in the high country. A promise made by people who never forgot a debt, though most men in this town would never know about it. Callan kept his voice level. I'm here to finalize the sale of my cattle. That's all. Vernon tilted his head, pretending to consider this. Your cattle, right? Those 6 skinny things you brought in. He looked at Dalton and Merritt. Did you boys see those cattle? Look half-starved to me. Look that. Wait, me too. Dalton said the animals were healthy. Callan had made sure of that. But the truth didn't matter here. Vernon was performing for the growing audience, and facts wouldn't change the script he had already written in his head. They're good cattle, Callan said quietly. The buyer already agreed to the price. The buyer, Vernon repeated, drawing the words out. He stepped closer, close enough that Ken could smell tobacco and expensive soap. See, that's interesting because I was talking to Hammond earlier and he mentioned he might reconsider that deal. Said maybe the cattle weren't worth what he thought. Ken's chest tightened. Hammond was the only buyer in town who would deal with him fairly. If Vernon had gotten to him, if he had pressured Hammond to back out, then this trip was wasted. The supplies Ken needed, the repairs waiting back at the ranch, all of it depended on that sale. Hammond gave his word, Callan said. Vernon smiled. Words change, especially when circumstances change. He glanced at the people watching, making sure they could hear. Some folks around here think you're not really one of us, Bridger. They think maybe you belong somewhere else out there. He gestured vaguely toward the foothills with your own kind. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Callan felt the shift in the crowd, the way some people looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Others watched with open curiosity, waiting to see how he would respond. Callan had heard worse. The town had never fully accepted him, not since he was a boy. His mother had been from elsewhere, from people who lived differently, and that different had marked him in ways that never quite faded. He had learned to carry it quietly, to work harder than others, to ask for nothing he hadn't earned. But standing here now, with Vernon's words echoing down the street and the eyes of the town on him, Callan felt something crack inside the careful control he had built over the years. I'm not looking for trouble, he said. I just want to complete my business. Trouble? Vernon laughed. Who said anything about trouble? We're just talking. He reached out and brushed dust off Ken's shoulder. The gesture condescending and invasive. You're too sensitive, Bridger. That's your problem. Can't take a little friendly conversation. Dalton moved closer on Ken's left side. Merritt positioned himself on the right. The 3 of them formed a loose triangle around him, and Ken realized with cold clarity that this had been planned. Vernon hadn't just happened to be here. He had been waiting. You know what I think? Vernon said, his voice still pleasant, but with an edge underneath. I think you should head back to your little dirt patch and forget about this sale. Let the real ranchers handle business in town. Callan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept them there. Fighting Vernon would only make things worse. The man had money, influence, and the kind of power that could make life impossible for someone. Like Ken, I have every right to be here, Callan said. Rights? Vernon shook his head slowly as if disappointed. You really don't understand how things work, do you? He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. This boy thinks he has the same rights as everyone else. Isn't that something? A few people laughed. Not many, but enough. And in that moment, Ken knew that whatever happened next, Vernon had already won this part of the fight. The humiliation was already taking shape, and there was no way to stop it without making everything worse. Vernon walked into the saloon. Dalton and Merritt stayed close to Callan, making it clear he wasn't free to leave. The crowd had grown larger, sensing that something was about to happen. People lined the wooden walkway, keeping their distance, but watching with the kind of attention reserved for spectacles. When Vernon emerged, he carried a bottle. The glass caught the sunlight as he walked back across the street, taking his time. letting anticipation build. He stopped directly in front of Kalen. You know what I think, Bridger? Vernon uncorked the bottle. I think you need to cool off. All that sensitivity, all that talk about rights, it's making you hot under the collar. Ken saw it coming but couldn't move. Dalton's hand clamped onto his left arm. Merritt grabbed the right. They held him in place, their grips tight enough to leave marks. Vernon raised the bottle. Let me help you with that. The whiskey hit Kalen's head in a cold, shocking cascade. It soaked through his hat, ran down his face, burned his eyes. The smell filled his nose and throat, making him gag. Laughter erupted from somewhere in the crowd. Harsh, ugly sounds that cut deeper than the liquid itself. Vernon emptied the entire bottle over him, taking his time, making sure everyone could see. When it was empty, he tossed the bottle aside. It shattered in the street. There, Vernon said, all cooled. Down now. Callan's vision blurred. Half from the alcohol, half from the rage, and humiliation burning through him. He tried to pull free, but Dalton and Merritt held firm. Vernon stepped closer, so close that only Kalen could hear his next words. You don't belong here. You never did, and everyone in this town knows it. Then Vernon shoved him hard. Kalen stumbled backward, his boots slipping in the dust. He fell, landing hard on his back in the middle of the street. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. More laughter this time louder. Vernon stood over him, making sure the crowd had a clear view. Look at him, Vernon announced. Can't even stay on his feet, and he thinks he's good enough to do business with the rest of us. Can push himself up to his hands and knees, whiskey still dripping from his hair onto the dirt. Beneath him, every instinct screamed at him to get up swinging, to wipe that smug look off Vernon's face. Consequences be damned. But he had lived long enough in this world to know what that would cost. Fighting back now would give Vernon exactly what he wanted, an excuse to escalate, to involve the law to make sure Kalen never set foot in town again. So instead, Kalen stood slowly. His legs shook. Whether from adrenaline or shame, he couldn't tell. He faced Vernon, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. You finished? Callan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vernon's smile widened. With you? Yeah, I'm finished. Now get out of my town. Your town, Kalen repeated. That's right, my town. And you're not welcome in it. Vernon gestured toward Kalen's horse. Take your skinny cattle and your ideas about rights and get back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Don't come back. The crowd parted as Kalen walked toward his horse. No one met his eyes. No one spoke in his defense. He was alone in a circle of witnesses who had chosen silence over intervention. He untied his horse with hands that trembled from rage, not fear. He swung into the saddle, still reeking of whiskey, still dripping onto the leather beneath him. As he turned the horse toward home, Kalen allowed himself one last look at Vernon. The older man stood in the center of the street, arms crossed victorious. Dalton and Merritt flanked him, grinning like men who had just won something worth celebrating. Kalen rode out of town in silence. Behind him, the laughter continued, already becoming the story that would be told and retold, each version making him smaller, more pathetic, more deserving of what had happened. But as the town disappeared behind him and the open land stretched ahead, something shifted in Ken's chest. The humiliation was still there, sharp and fresh. But underneath it, deeper and colder, something else was waking up. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. The news traveled faster than Kalen's horse. By the time he reached his ranch, the story had already crossed the foothills and reached the camps scattered among the high country. 3 different witnesses had seen what happened in town, and one of them had a connection that mattered more than Vernon Haskell could have imagined. In the high country, where the air grew thin and the land belonged to those who had lived there long before any town was built, a young scout named Maka listened to his cousin describe the scene in detail. The whiskey poured over a man's head, the laughter, the fall, the expulsion. You're certain it was him? Maka asked. I saw the scar on his wrist when they held him, his cousin said. The mark we gave him. It was Kalen Bridger. Maka's expression darkened. He stood immediately, not bothering to finish the meal in front of him. I need to speak with Takakoda. The camp was 3 hours away on horseback. Maka rode hard, arriving just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. He found Chief Takakoda outside his dwelling, working on a saddle that needed repair. The older man looked up as Maka dismounted, and something in the scout's face made him set his tools aside. What happened? Takakoda asked. Maka told him everything. The words came quickly, precisely leaving nothing out. As he spoke, other members of the tribe began to gather, sensing the weight of what was being discussed. By the time Maka finished, nearly 40 people had formed a circle around them. Takakoda's jaw tightened. He was 50 winters old, and his face carried the marks of a life spent leading his people through difficult times. But right now, those who knew him well could see something specific rising in his expression. Not just anger, but the kind of cold determination that preceded decisive action. He is her brother, Takakoda said quietly. The one who gave me breath when I had none. The one who risked everything when he was only a child. What do we do? Maka asked. Takakoda looked at the gathered people, then beyond them to the mountains. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking through what this meant and what it would require. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying across the camp. Summon the council. Send riders to the other camps. Tell them what has happened. Tell them that the man who saved my life, the one we named brother, has been dishonored by those who think power makes them untouchable. How many should come? Someone asked. All who can ride, Takakoda said. All who remember the oath we made. All who understand that a debt like this does not fade with time. The camp erupted into motion. Riders departed in multiple directions, carrying the message to distant groups scattered throughout the territory. Weapons were checked. Horses were prepared. Supplies were gathered. The activity continued through the evening and into the night, steady and purposeful. Takakoda worked alongside his people, but his mind was elsewhere. He was remembering a day 10 years earlier when a boy with scared eyes and steady hands had refused to leave him to. That boy had become a man, and now that man had been treated like refugees in his own town. As midnight approached, riders began arriving from the other camps. They came in groups of 10, 20, 30, each group added to the growing number gathering in the high country. No one questioned why they had been summoned. The message had been clear and the obligation clearer. By dawn, nearly 300 mounted warriors had assembled. They stood in formation across the valley floor, silent and ready. Takakota rode slowly along their ranks, seeing faces he had known for decades and others he barely recognized. Young men who had heard the stories but never met the boy who had saved their chief's life. He stopped at the front of the formation and turned to face them all. We ride now, Dakota said, not for war, for justice, for honor, for the man who proved that courage has no age and kindness, no boundary. The warriors responded with silence, the kind of silence that meant absolute agreement. 10 years earlier, Kalen Bridger had been 12 years old and hunting alone in the foothills for the first time. His mother had been gone for 2 years, and his father had become distant, drinking more and working less. Callan had learned to fend for himself, and that meant bringing home meat when he could. He had tracked a deer for most of the morning, but the animal had spooked before he could get close enough for a clean shot. Frustrated and tired, Callan had decided to head home when he heard something unusual, labored breathing coming from behind a cluster of rocks near a dried creek bed. He approached carefully, his small rifle ready. What he found made his stomach tighten with fear. A man lay crumpled against the rocks, barely conscious. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages wrapped around his side and leg. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. He looked like he had been there for hours, maybe longer. Kalen's first instinct was to run. This man was from the tribes in the high country. His clothing and the markings on his possessions made that clear. Kalen's father had always told him to stay away from those people, that they were dangerous, that getting involved would only bring trouble. But as Kalen stood there, the man's eyes opened. They locked onto Ken's face with a clarity that seemed impossible given his condition. The man tried to speak, but only managed a weak sound. His hand moved slightly as if trying to reach for something. Callan should have left. That would have been the safe choice, the smart choice. But looking at this dying man, he couldn't make his feet move. He thought about his mother, about the way she had always helped people. Even when it cost her something, she would have known what to do. So Ken made a decision. He set down his rifle and moved closer. The man's wounds were serious. A deep gash along his ribs, another in his thigh. Both had bled heavily. An infection was already setting in. Ken had basic knowledge of treating injuries from the animals he hunted. But this was different. This was a person, and the stakes felt impossibly high. He used his water to clean the wounds as best he could. He tore strips from his own shirt to create fresh bandages. The man groaned in pain, but didn't cry out. Kalen worked quickly, his hands steadier than he expected. When the bleeding was under control, Kalen faced his next problem. The man needed real help. Medicine, shelter, someone who knew more than a 12-year-old boy with shaking hands. But the nearest settlement was hours away, and Ken couldn't carry a full grown man that distance. Instead, he made the man as comfortable as possible, gave him all his water, and then ran. He ran harder than he had ever run, his lungs burning, his legs screaming, driven by the fear that if he didn't move fast enough, the man would die before help arrived. It took him 3 hours to find a tribal camp. He approached it despite his fear, despite every warning he had ever received, and he told them where their man was and what condition he was in. The warriors didn't thank him. They didn't speak to him at all. They simply mounted their horses and followed him back to the creek bed. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, and Kalen feared he had been too slow. But the man was still alive, barely, but alive. As the warriors lifted their chief, because that's who he was. Kalen learned later onto a litter. Takakoda opened his eyes. One more time, he looked directly at Kalen and spoke in broken English. You saved me. Why? Kalen didn't know how to answer. He was just a kid who had made a choice that felt right in the moment. Because you needed help, Kalen said simply. Takakoda held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. I will remember. 3 weeks later, Callan found a mark carved into a tree near his home, a specific symbol he didn't recognize, and underneath it, a single word scratched into the bark in English. Brother Vernon Haskell woke to a sound he couldn't immediately identify. The first light of dawn was breaking through his window, painting the room in shades of gray and amber. He lay in bed for a moment listening. Then he heard again. Not quite thunder, but something similar. Rhythmic, heavy, growing steadily louder. He rose and moved to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold across his property, stretching from one edge of his vision to the other. Mounted warriors sat in perfect silence. Hundreds of them. The dawn light illuminated them clearly now. Warriors on horses, all facing his house, all completely still. There, presence stark and undeniable in the breaking day. His hands trembled as he grabbed his pants and boots. This wasn't possible. This didn't happen. Not here. Not to him. Dalton and Merritt were already awake when Vernon burst into the main room. They stood at the front window, their faces pale, their bodies rigid with fear. How many? Vernon asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. I stopped counting at 200, Dalton said, his voice tight. There's more behind those. A lot more. Vernon moved to the door and stepped onto the porch. The sight was even more overwhelming from this position. Warriors filled his yard, his fields, the road leading to his property. They formed ranks so dense and organized that Vernon couldn't see the ground beneath their horse hoofs. And in the center of it all, standing alone in the open space between the house and the warriors, was Kalen Bridger. The young rancher stood with his feet planted, his arms at his sides, his face calm. He wore the same clothes from the day before, the ones still stained with whiskey, but everything about his posture had changed. He wasn't the man who had been pushed down in the dirt. He was something else now, something Vernon hadn't seen or understood a week ago. Behind Call, one warrior rode forward. Slowly. He was older, his face marked with lines earned through decades of leadership. He stopped his horse beside Kalen and dismounted. The two men stood together, and Vernon suddenly understood with terrible clarity that he had made a catastrophic error. Takakota spoke, his voice carrying across the silent morning. Vernon Haskell, 7 days ago you poured spirits over this man's head. You pushed him to the ground. You laughed at him. You told him he did not belong. Vernon tried to speak, but his throat had closed. Behind him, he heard Dalton and Merritt breathing hard. Panic barely. Contained. This man, Dakota, continued, saved my life when he was only a child. He asked nothing in return. He expected nothing. But we do not forget. And when we learned what you did to him, we knew that such dishonor could not stand unanswered. Callan finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. I didn't ask them to come. They came because that's who they are. Because they understand. Something you never will. That respect isn't taken. It's earned. And cruelty always finds its way back to the one who showed it first. Vernon's legs felt weak. He gripped the porch railing to steady himself. Around him, other ranch. Hands had emerged from the bunkhouse drawn by the commotion. They stood frozen, understanding that any sudden movement could turn this gathering into something far worse. What do you want? Vernon managed to ask. Takakota looked at Kalen, giving him the choice. Kalen met Vernon's eyes, and in that gaze, Vernon saw something that terrified him. More than the warriors. Not hatred, but cold justice. I want what you took from me, Kalen said. My dignity, my right to walk through town without fear. My place in this territory that you tried to erase. And how do I give you that? Vernon asked, though he already knew the answer would cost him everything he had built. You will walk into town, Kalen said. All three of you, Dalton Merritt, and you will stand in the same street where you humiliated me. And you will tell everyone what you did. Vernon's face drained of color. That's it. Just tell the truth. No, Dakota said. That is where it begins. Within an hour, the entire town had gathered. Word had spread quickly. 300 warriors had ridden down from the high country, and they had come for Vernon Haskell. People lined both sides of the main street, packed onto porches and leaning out of windows. Some looked frightened, others looked curious. A few looked satisfied, as if they had been waiting for something like this. Vernon stood in the center of the street, exactly where Callan had fallen a week earlier. Dalton and Merritt flanked him, their earlier confidence completely gone. The three men looked small, surrounded by watching eyes and the silent presence of mounted warriors positioned at both ends of the street. Kalen stood facing them. Takakota remained mounted nearby, his presence a reminder of what power truly looked like when it served justice instead of cruelty. Tell them, Kalen said. Vernon cleared his throat. His voice came out weak at first, then grew marginally stronger under the weight of necessity. A week ago, I humiliated Kalen Bridger in this town. I poured whiskey over him. I pushed him down. I mocked him and told him he didn't belong here. I was wrong. The crowd was silent. Vernon glanced at Takakota, who nodded once, indicating he should continue. I did it because I could, Vernon said. The admission costing him something visible. Because I thought my money and my land made me better than him, because people in this town would let me do it and say nothing. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The truth was cutting. Both ways now, implicating not just Vernon, but everyone who had watched and done nothing. Ken stepped closer. Now, you understand what it feels like to stand here while everyone watches. To know that what happens next will define how people see you for a long time to come. He turned to address the crowd. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because what happened to me could happen to anyone you decide isn't worth protecting. And that should scare all of you more than any number of warriors ever could. Takakota dismounted and walked to Ken's side. He spoke to the crowd in English, his words deliberate. This man has lived between your world and ours. He honors both. He asked for nothing but what should be his the right to work his land, sell his cattle, walk your streets without fear of being destroyed for amusement. He turned to Vernon. Your land borders territory that my people have watched for generations. You will sign over the northern section, the part that touches the foothills. It will belong to Kalen Bridger. Now, this is the price of your cruelty. Vernon's face went white. That land was worth more than everything else he owned combined. That's half my ranch. Yes, Takakota said simply. Vernon looked around desperately, searching for support that didn't exist. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. I'll sign the papers. Takakota turned to Dalton and Merritt. You two will leave this territory today. If you return, you will face justice that makes this morning feel like mercy. Neither man argued. They simply nodded. Their faces hollow. The crowd watched as Vernon, Dalton, and Merritt walked away in different directions. Vernon toward the land, office to sign over his property. The other two toward horses that would carry them far from this place. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any words could have been. Kalen stood in the street, surrounded by the same people who had watched him fall a week earlier. But this time, when he met their eyes, they looked away first. The shift was complete. The power had moved, and everyone in that town understood that the world they thought they knew had fundamentally changed. 3 days after the confrontation, Kalen stood on land that was now legally his. The papers had been signed, witnessed, and filed. The northern section of what had been Vernon's ranch stretched before him. Rolling grassland that met the foothills. Good water, shelter from the worst weather. It was more land than he had ever imagined owning, and it had come to him not through inheritance or purchase, but through justice delayed and finally delivered. Takakota rode up the path toward where Kalen stood. The chief had stayed in the area to ensure the transfer was completed properly. But now it was time for him and his people to return to the high country. 300 warriors didn't remain in one place long, without reason, and the reason had been fulfilled. The land suits you, Takakota said, dismounting. It sits between worlds like you do. Kalen smiled slightly. I don't know what I'm going to do with all of it. You'll figure it out. You always have. Takakota paused, looking across the territory. The town will treat you differently now. Some will respect you. Others will fear you. A few will resent you. All of them will. Remember what happened. I didn't want this, Ken said quietly. Any of it. I just wanted to sell my cattle and go home. I know, but life rarely limits itself to what we want. It gives us what we need. And sometimes what we need is to stand up and be counted. Takakota placed a hand on Ken's shoulder. You saved my life when you were just a boy. You didn't have to. You had every reason not to, but you did it anyway, because that's who you are. And when you needed us, we came. That's who we are. The debt is paid, but the bond remains. Ken felt his throat tighten. Thank you for everything. Don't thank me. Just live. Well, build something on this land. Show these people what it means to earn respect through action rather than demand it through power. Takakoda mounted his horse. And if you ever need us again, you know where to find us. Ken watched as Takakoda rode back down the path toward where the warriors had made camp. Within an hour, they would all be gone, returning to the high country, leaving behind only the memory of what had happened and the lessons learned by those who witnessed it. That afternoon, Callan rode into town. He needed supplies to begin work on his expanded property, and he wanted to see how people would react now that the dust had settled. The difference was immediate. People who had looked away a week ago now nodded when he passed. Merchants who had been curt were now respectful. Hammond, the cattle buyer Vernon had approached Callan directly. "I want to apologize," Hammond said, "for backing out of our deal. Vernon put pressure on me, and I should have stood firm." Callan considered this. "You did what you thought you had to do. I understand that. Still wrong, though." Hammond extended his hand. "If you're willing, I'd like to do business with you properly from now on. Fair prices, honest dealing." Callan shook his hand. "I'd appreciate that." As he loaded supplies onto his wagon, Callan caught sight of his reflection in a store window. He looked the same as always, same clothes, same face, same quiet demeanor. But something fundamental had shifted. He walked differently now, carried himself with a certainty that hadn't been there before. Vernon was gone, moved to a smaller property on the far edge of the territory. Dalton and Merritt had left entirely, their names already fading from local conversation. The street where Callan had been, humiliated, now belonged to his story in a different way. Not as the place where he fell, but as the place where justice finally answered cruelty. Callan drove his wagon home as the sun moved toward the horizon, his new land waiting for the work that would transform it into something lasting. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen. Now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and justice meet in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.